At the beginning of March, Grossman was attached to the headquarters of the Third Ukrainian Front. The Germans had held on to the Black Sea coast despite being outflanked by the thrust of the First Ukrainian Front to the north. UPA.1. In the first week of March, Marshal Zhukov had taken over from Vatutin, mortally wounded on 29 February, when ambushed by Ukrainian partisans of the Zhukov directed a new offensive towards Ternopil. Also in the first week of March, Marshal Konev's Second Ukrainian Front attacked towards Uman, which they seized along with large quantities of military stores just 5 days later, on the 10th of March. 200 German tanks, 600 guns, and many thousands of vehicles, immobilized in the deep mud and abandoned by their crews, were taken along the way. Red Army soldiers cursed the spring mud of the Rasputitsa, but the Germans suffered far more. Konev's armoured columns pushed onwards to seize bridgeheads across the southern reaches of the Bug. They were less than 100 kilometres from the Moldovan border and the river Dnester, which was first crossed on 17th March, 12 days after the start of the offensive. German divisions, reduced to a fraction of their usual strength, had to fight their way out of encirclements and retreat rapidly, slipping through between Soviet armies. In many cases, parachute supply drops by the Luftwaffe kept them going, but the will to escape was intense. No German wanted to suffer the fate of Paulus's Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Meanwhile, in another coordinated offensive, Malinovsky's Third Ukrainian Front had swept forward from the Ingolets, crossing 2 more rivers and attempting to cut off 7 German divisions. The advance, however, was at the mercy of the elements. Before the attack, the military council of the front had been thinking above all of the weather. They kept looking at the barometer. A professor of meteorology had been summoned, as well as an old man, expert in the local weather, who could forecast it by looking at some indications of which no one else knew. Officers attended lectures on meteorology. On the 6th of March, General Rodion I Malinovsky's Third Ukrainian Front launched an offensive along the Black Sea coast to capture Odessa. The enemy consisted of the German Sixth Army, a recreation of the original army at Stalingrad. This was on Hitler's orders, as if it would wipe out the defeat. Lieutenant General Phi A. Pliev's cavalry, 4th Guards Cavalry Corps, and 4th Mechanized Corps. Cavalry was of great use in the heavy mud. The front HQ was in the village of Novaya Odessa, some 90 kilometers from Odessa. Terrible mud. If Rudny hadn't helped, I wouldn't have managed to drag my suitcase from the airfield to the headquarters. Advancing in the mud requires an enormous physical effort. Quantities of petrol, which would otherwise have been sufficient to go hundreds of kilometers, are burned up over a few hundred meters. Mobile groups are cutting off German communications, supplies, and liaison. Sometimes Germans retreat chaotically. The whole steppe is filled with the howling of vehicles and tractors tearing themselves out of the mud. The roads are hundreds of meters wide. Grossman described the advance in great detail for an article in Krasnaya Zvezda. Finally, the sun is getting hotter and hotter, and light clouds of dust have already appeared flying behind the trucks. A thin, swarthy captain in a greatcoat whose flaps are covered with scales of brown and red earth inhaled this dust with delight. Oh, imagine how dreadful the mud has been if dust, this scourge of the war, now seems nicer than all the spring flowers. For us, the dust smells good today. Several days ago, a shrill howling of 1.5-ton trucks, 3-tonners, 5-ton YAZ'd tractors, Caterpillar transporters, Dodges and Studebakers hung constantly over this steppe. They were howling in an angry effort to break out from the mud's claws to catch up with the sleepless infantry. Their fierce but powerless wheels only threw out sticky lumps of mud, spinning in the oily, slippery ruts. And thousands of sinewy, thin, sweating people were heaving at the rear ends of bogged-down vehicles, their teeth clenched day and night under the eternal rain and the eternal 3 times accursed, wet, melting snow. Who will recount the great feats of our people? Who will recreate the epic of this unprecedented offensive, this sleepless advance that went on day and night? Infantrymen were marching, loaded with 1.5 issues of ammunition, 3 and their greatcoats wet and as heavy as lead. A severe north wind sprang upon them. Their greatcoats froze and became rigid like sheet iron. Cushions of mud weighing a pood apiece stuck to the boots. Sometimes people only managed 1 kilometre an hour, so hard was this road. For many kilometres around, there wasn't a dry patch of land. Soldiers had to sit down in the mud to have some rest or take off their boots to rewrap their footcloths. Mortar men were moving forward beside the riflemen, and each of them was carrying 6 bombs hanging on loops of rope on their backs and chests. "That's all right," they said. "It's even harder for the Germans. It's death for Germans now." No work was more terrible than building a bridge over the southern Bug. The sappers only had a tiny bridgehead on the west bank. The enemy was pressing hard, and the sappers were building the bridge not just under German fire, but right in the midst of the firing itself. The marsh seemed bottomless. A test pile went in 11 meters deep, as if into pastry. Once Malinovsky's armies had captured the city of Nikolaev at the mouth of the Bug, the way to Odessa lay open before them. Marshal Konev was ordered to swing some of his formations southwards to trap the German 6th and 8th armies, as well as the hapless Romanian 3rd Army between his forces and Malinovsky's armies. The German military authorities have sent the commander of the 16th Motorized Division 5 for trial by court-martial. His explanation: "Without their vehicles, my men are weaker than an infantry division." The enemy fear being encircled. They don't believe that their defense lines are strong because their commanders keep deceiving them the whole time. Characteristics of our officers during this new phase: 1. Will. 2. Confidence. 3. Scorn towards the enemy. 4. Ability to fight using the force of tanks and artillery, the infantry being small in number. 5. Ability to save, to keep account of every cartridge and shell, a big war with poor reserves. 6. They have learned to hurry, but it isn't their motto, it is just in everyone's blood. They hurry to cross the rivers because it is much quicker to use a branch than to wait for days on end for pontoons. The speed of pursuit matches the speed of the enemy's retreat. Odessa was finally secured on the 10th of April. It had been garrisoned mainly by the 3rd Romanian Army. The Romanian occupation of the southwestern Ukraine was almost gentle in comparison to the German treatment of the population. Grossman entered with the liberators and looked around Peresip, a district in Odessa, the day of the capture of Odessa. The port is empty. Puffs of smoke, thunder of military vehicles and equipment pouring into the city, crowds of people, scorched corpses carried out of the Gestapo building, the charred corpse of a girl with beautiful golden hair intact, signs over Romanian canteens, entrance forbidden to Germans. The first meeting of the Odessa Obcom. The Obcom secretary has invited me to participate. This is the first time that I, not a member of the party, have attended such a meeting. There is a lot of food, sugar, cakes, flour. The locals are cursing Romanians reluctantly, as if out of politeness. The prospect of the end of the war hastened the optimism of many civilians as well as Red Army soldiers. With the defeat of fascism, they told themselves, Stalin could disband the NKVD secret police and the Gulag camps. Grossman had already heard such talk in the trenches of Stalingrad, and it appears that he shared their hopes. But he now seems to have sensed that Stalinism would not change its spots. Odessa's old men in the boulevard. Their fantastic talk about a complete reorganization of Soviet government after the war. A poet who had published under the Romanians a book of poetry entitled I Sing Today. Our conversation. He is an extremely unpleasant person. Suddenly, I see his mother standing under the window outside. In her eyes, there is a terrible fear for her son. Ostrovets, Point 7, Eisenstadt Simon, the son of a famous rabbi from the little town of a Russian girl, had saved his life. She had been sheltering him in her room for more than a year. His story. Ghetto in Warsaw, the uprising. Poles had brought in the weapons. Polish Jews had to wear a white armband. Belgian and French Jews, a yellow one. Treblinka, near Warsaw, the extermination camp for Jews. There was a chamber with moving knives. It was in a basement, under a banya. The bodies were cut into pieces and then burned. There were mountains of ashes, 20 to 25 meters high. In one place, Jews had been chased into a pond full of acid. Their screams were so terrible that local peasants abandoned their homes. 58,000 Odessa Jews were burned alive in Berezovka. Some of them were burned to death in railway carriages. Others were taken to a clearing where Germans poured petrol over them and then set them on fire. The account of OBKOM Secretary Ria Sensev. Domanevka was the place where Jews had been executed. 9. The executions were carried out by the Ukrainian police. The chief of police in Domanevka had killed 12,000 people himself. In November 1942, Antonescu issued a law giving rights to Jews. 10 mass executions, which had gone on throughout 1942, halted. The chief of police in Domanevka and 8 of his closest associates were arrested by Romanians, taken to Tiraspol 11 and sent for trial. The court sentenced them to 3 months forced labour for their unlawful deeds towards the Jews. Outrage was caused by the public prosecutor from Domanevka, a Russian lawyer from Odessa, who killed 8 or 9 people a day for amusement. This was called going shooting. They used to kill people in separate lots. Children were thrown alive into dry moats with straw burning on the bottom. By the time Antonescu's order was published, there were about 380 Odessa Jews left in Domanevka and 40 children in a nursery. They are still alive, have no clothes or shoes. The total number of Odessa Jews executed in Domanevka was about 90,000. Those who survived received aid from the Jewish Committee in Romania. Romanian Jews were executed too, along with Jews from Odessa. They had been tricked into going to Domanevka. This was how one of the richest Romanian millionaires was executed. He was brought to Domanevka under the pretext of organizing the excavation and exploitation of the local ceramic clay. There were 3 Jews who participated in the torture and executions. They have been arrested. In Odessa, they had rounded up Jews and let them go home. Then, on the 10th of January 1942, they herded them into a ghetto in Slobodka. It was very cold, and when they were being driven from the ghetto to the trains, there remained hundreds of corpses of old people, children and women lying around in the streets. Having discovered that so many people he had known were now dead, Grossman had a contrary experience that spring, not far from Berdyshev. He visited a tank brigade of the 1st Ukrainian Front, which was refitting at Vinnytsia, where Hitler's headquarters, codenamed Werwolf, had been based. He had dinner with the brigade commander, a short, calm and good-natured man, as Ortenberg described him in this account. During dinner, when talking of dates and places of battles, Grossman realized that this was the very same Babajanian who had commanded the 395th Regiment and whom he had made the hero of his novel, The People Immortal. "Yes, I was there," confirmed Babajanian, "but you killed me." "I killed you," Grossman answered, "but I can resurrect you too." After the complete liberation of Leningrad and the rapid reconquest of the Ukraine, Stalin consulted with his Stavka advisors. They consisted of Zhukov, the deputy supreme commander, Vasilevsky, the chief of the general staff, his deputy, General Antonov, and General Shtemenko, too, the chief of operations. In late April, the front commanders were allowed to consolidate their positions and go on to the defensive while the operational plan was decided. By the end of April, Stalin had chosen Belorussia for the next major blow. A success there would provide them with an intermediate position ready to strike towards Berlin early the following year. After the defeated Germans in the south were thrown back into Romania, Grossman was transferred northwards to the eastern border of Belorussia, the last major area of Soviet territory still under Nazi occupation. He found himself close to where he had started the war less than 3 years before. Eastern Belorussia was now to provide the start line for the most ambitious operation in the Nazi-Soviet conflict. The Stavka had just been informed by the Americans and British that Operation Overlord would take place at the end of May. Planning to attack the Great Belarusian Bulge went ahead under conditions of total secrecy. Apart from Stalin, only 5 men were privy to the plan. They knew that they had to mislead the Germans about the axis of attack. The tank armies in the south were kept there and grouped together to suggest the preparation of another massive blow south of the Pripet marshes. Radio silence was also imposed on the 3 Ukrainian fronts to suggest an imminent attack, and rumours were spread of a naval landing on the Black Sea coast of Romania. The Germans fell for the diversion. They reinforced the southern sectors, especially around Lvov. The Soviet plan, involving 1,250,000 men, was finalized on the 20th of May. Meanwhile, newly reinforced tank formations were secretly moved to the eastern border of Belorussia. Stalin himself chose the operational codename of Bagration in honor of the great Georgian general who had been mortally wounded at Borodino. Rokossovsky, a Pole who'd been arrested before the war and tortured by. Beria's NKVD had dared to stand up to Stalin in a furious argument over the first phase, which involved flanking attacks via Vitebsk and Babruisk on the 2 flanks of the Belarusian Balcony to encircle Minsk. Both Molotov and Malenkov tried to persuade Rokossovsky not to disagree with the Vozhd, the boss. "Do you know who you are arguing with?" they said. But Stalin respected Rokossovsky's courage and accepted his point. The Western Allies landed in Normandy on the 6th of June, while the Red Army waited impatiently for new equipment and reinforcements to arrive on a severely overtaxed railway system. Grossman noted the reaction to events in Normandy, on the subject of the Second Front. Great enthusiasm on the first day. Spontaneous meetings, shooting, saluting, then a sharp decrease of interest. A trait of character, one man said when he was on a train and learned about the attack by the Allies. "Well, probably they won't even detrain us now." Few soldiers, or even officers, ever had a chance to discover anything about life beyond their own unit, so an outsider like Grossman was bombarded with questions. Those most often asked by officers and soldiers are on international matters, and they are very numerous. They include the Second Front, Japan, Turkey, Iran, and hundreds of other issues. Questions about internal affairs are less numerous. Asking their questions, people apparently want to find out about the duration and course of the war. Grossman joined General Batov's 65th Army, part of Marshal Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front, in time for the Great Offensive. After several delays, it finally began on the 22nd of June, the 3rd anniversary of the Nazi invasion. 2 days later, 3 of Rokossovsky's armies, Gorbatov's 3rd Army, Romanenko's 48th and Batov's 65th, emerged from the boggy forests on the northern edge of the Pripet marshes to attack the German 9th Army round Babruisk on the river Haman, 3 Beresina. On 27th June, the German defenders, some 5,000 men from the 383rd Infantry Division, managed to fight off the first attempt to storm the town. Then they found that they were surrounded. Led by their commander, General, they tried to fight their way out of the north side of the city, but were cut off by Gorbatov's 3rd Army. Grossman, describing the scenes he encountered in Babruisk, was unlike most Soviet journalists who concentrated on extolling the collective strength of the Red Army. He was always interested in the individual, even amid the dehumanized carnage of the battlefield. Sometimes you are so shaken by what you've seen, blood rushes from your heart, and you know that the terrible sight that your eyes have just taken in is going to haunt you and lie heavily on your soul all your life. It is strange that when you sit down to write about it, you don't find enough room for it on paper. You write about a tank corps, about heavy artillery, but suddenly remember how bees were swarming in a burning village, and a barefooted old Belarusian climbed out of a little trench where he was hiding from shells and took the swarm off a branch, how soldiers were looking at him, and my God, one can read so much in their thoughtful, melancholy eyes. In these little things exists the soul of the people and our war with its suffering and its victories. How were we to find our old Stalingrad acquaintances amid this dust and smoke, roar of engines, clatter of tank tracks and self-propelled guns, and the squeaking of long columns of carts moving west, and a flow of barefooted children and women wearing white kerchiefs moving east back home? Some kind people advised us to look for a well-known feature of this division in order to avoid unnecessary stops and inquiries. This was a camel called Kuznechik, Grasshopper, in the supply unit of its artillery regiment. This camel, who came from Kazakhstan, has come all the way from Stalingrad to the Beresina. Liaison officers usually look for Kuznechik in the supply unit and do not need other inquiries to find the headquarters, which is on the move day and night. We took this unusual advice as a joke and moved on. The first thing we see when we return to the dust and thundering of the main road is a brown camel pulling a cart. He is almost bald, having lost his hair. It proves to be the famous Kuznechik. A crowd of captured Germans is moving in the opposite direction. The camel turns his ugly head towards them, his lower lip turned down with a look of disdain. It is probably the unusual colour of the prisoners' uniforms or their unusual smell that have caught his attention. The driver of the cart says to the soldiers escorting the prisoners in a businesslike way, "Give these Germans to us here. Kuznechik is going to eat them now." And presently we learn this camel's biography. He hides in craters from shells and bombs if there's a bombardment. He has already earned 3 wound stripes and the medal for the defense of Stalingrad. The commander of the artillery regiment, Kapramanian, has promised the driver a decoration if he reaches Berlin with Kuznechik .5, the route indicated by Kuznechik, and found the division. We followed. I didn't find many of my old acquaintances in Gurtiev's division, whom I remembered well from our brief encounters. Gurtiev himself was killed in the fighting for Oral when a shell exploded at the observation post. He protected General Gorbatov with his body. Splashes of this soldier general's blood were found on Gorbatov's cap. When we entered Babruisk, some buildings in it were ablaze and others lay in ruins. To Babruisk led the road of revenge. With difficulty, our car finds its way amid scorched and distorted German tanks and self-propelled guns. Men are walking over German corpses. Corpses, hundreds and thousands of them, pave the road, lie in ditches, under the pines, in the green barley. In some places, vehicles have to drive over the corpses, so densely they lie upon the ground. People are busy all the time burying them, but they are so many that this work cannot be done in just one day. And the day is exhaustingly hot still, and people walk and drive pressing handkerchiefs to their noses. A cauldron of death was boiling here, where the revenge was carried out. A ruthless, terrible revenge over those who hadn't surrendered their arms and tried to break out to the west. A German soldier wounded in the legs is sitting on a low, sandy bank of the Beresina by the route into the burning and destroyed Babruisk. He raises his head and looks up at the tank columns moving across the bridge at the artillery. A Red Army soldier comes up to him, takes some water from the river in a tin and gives it to him to drink. I couldn't help thinking, what would this German have done in the summer of 1941 when panzer columns of their troops were moving east across this bridge if he had seen one of our soldiers with wounded legs sitting here on the sandy bank? Grossman was allowed to interview captured German generals. Lieutenant General von Lützow, the commander of the 35th Army Corps, was a 52-year-old Prussian who had been captured near Babruisk in another of the encirclements. According to most accounts, he had collapsed under the strain of defending an impossible bastion while Hitler refused requests to retreat. Lieutenant General Lützow does not praise our army particularly highly. The soldiers are devoid of initiative. When they have no leader on the battlefield, they do not know what to do. The artillery is strong. the Soviet Air Force drops bombs with no aim whatsoever. Lutsov was complaining about his total lack of freedom of action. For example, he needed permission from Army headquarters to leave a position, the Army needed permission from the headquarters of the Army Group, and the Army Group needed that of the General Staff headquarters. Lutsov received permission to retreat with the 35th Army Corps only when the ring of encirclement had already been closed. SS sick General Hain about himself. "I'm a Frontschwein." Most of the German generals, officers and soldiers captured during Operation Bagration were forced to march through Moscow in a victory parade on 17th July. Soviet propaganda had been so exaggerated that many Russian children had expected to see ravening beasts, not defeated soldiers. In any case, it underlined the importance of this massive German defeat in which the Wehrmacht lost around 1/3 men, an even greater loss than at Stalingrad. Soviet intelligence officers evidently briefed Grossman on what they had found among the captured papers and on other interrogations of prisoners. A German map had been captured. The data marked was absolutely identical to the map compiled by our intelligence department. Not only divisions, but also the reserves, forming up points, etc., were identical. A captured German officer says that German officers are constantly discussing possible attacks by the Russians. Few believed they'd managed to hold the line. More often, they speak about the gigantic Belarusian mousetrap. Before the Soviet attack, Field Marshal Bush went round the front units to inspire cheerfulness and perseverance. Germans have already withdrawn some units from the front and are pulling them far inland, probably in connection with the invasion by the Allies. For the advance against Minsk to the northwest, Grossman rejoined General Batov's 65th Army. In just over a week, the defense lines of Army Group Center had been destroyed. The Germans had lost 200,000 men and 900 tanks, but Soviet casualties had also been terrifying in many sectors. Even Red Army generals hardened to the slaughter were shaken. Yet the battle had only just begun. Hitler and the German High Command had still not realized that the Soviet strategy was aimed at two sets of pincers, an inner encirclement of Minsk and an outer encirclement to trap the whole of Army Group Center. On the 3rd of July, Soviet tanks entered the suburbs of Minsk. Another 100,000 German soldiers were trapped and nearly half of them were killed. Grossman's notes at this stage are random, including past atrocities, revenge, and descriptions. Italian soldiers, who had already suffered in Russia for the fascist cause, which most of them did not believe in, then found themselves after the armistice as prisoners and slave laborers of the Germans. Grossman even heard of some being killed by former Red Army soldiers serving the Wehrmacht in some capacity. Italians executed by Vlasov men. Mass killing of Red Army prisoners of war on the 12th to 13th February 1944. In the morning, the whole length of Sovietskaya Street was piled with many thousands of bodies. Fire in the districts close to the river. Hundreds of thousands of people who have lost all their possessions in the fire are sitting on their bundles. Armchairs, paintings, deer's heads with horns, girls holding kittens. German prisoners are walking on their own. They are sulky. One of them straightens his uniform whenever he sees a vehicle and salutes it. Another version of this description suggests that the German prisoner in question was probably suffering from battle shock. Revenge killings were unsurprising after the appalling anti-partisan war waged in Belarusia by the Germans and their auxiliaries, whom the Red Army often referred to generically as Vlasovci. A partisan, a small man, has killed 2 Germans with a stake. He had pleaded with the guards of the column to give him these Germans. He had convinced himself that they were the ones who had killed his daughter Olia and his sons, his 2 boys. He broke all their bones and smashed their skulls, and while he was beating them, he was crying and shouting, "Here you are, for Olia! Here you are, for Kolia!" When they were dead, he propped the bodies up against a tree stump and continued to beat them. Vlasovci are being killed. People are killing their compatriots. A man from Orel kills a man from the Orel region. An Uzbek kills an Uzbek. There are already next to no German airfields left on our territory. Our fighters are already flying over their land. It won't be long now before their country is ablaze. Harmonicas. Everyone has got hold of a German harmonica. It is a soldier's musical instrument, because it is the only one which can be played, even quite easily, when sitting on a jolting cart or a vehicle. There are 14 nationalities in the division. It's so hard to find any paper to make cigarettes that there are cases of men using their wound certificates and other documents. Signaler Skvortsov is small, plain. He has 3 fiancées. One of them has sent him a photo, but this wasn't her photo. The second one has made a suit for him, size 48, while he wears 46. He shouts to the girls from the political department, "We're all in the reserve here. Why are you chasing stars and shoulder boards? When the war ends, you'll be left with nothing." A gun layer, Guard Sergeant Konkov, was the only one to survive. He forced 40 captured Germans, threatening them with his submachine gun, to manhandle the howitzer, and fired point blank. Grossman had great admiration for General Batov, the commander of the 65th Army, who had been ordered by Rokossovsky to head west for Warsaw. Batov is not prone to Russian optimism. Routine is harmful even in victorious actions. And like the best commanders at Stalingrad, such as Gurtiev, who had made his men dig trenches, then steamed them with tanks, Batov believed in realistic exercises. Training before an offensive. If there's a swamp with water up to one's chest, one must train in the swamp. If there's a gully, then lie down in the gully. Conversation with the Chief of Staff of Artillery. Russian guns. The masterpiece of Russian artillery is the 152mm howitzer. It is a cannon and howitzer at the same time. Artillery suits the spirit of the Russian people. An artillery spotter is an infantryman. He brings to the gun the richness and enterprise of his character, strength of firepower. The Germans, having started with an emphasis on technology at the beginning of the war, are now turning to infantry, while we, having started with infantry, are finding more and more support in technology. German reconnaissance is poor. They fire on an area. They also abandon guns easily. They flee even before the infantry does, while our infantry usually starts running away before the artillerists. Although the German artillery's bag charge of nitroglycerin is more powerful than our pyroxylin, German cannon is fragile and does not last long. On the 13th of July, another blow was launched at the Germans. The First Ukrainian Front, now commanded by Marshal Konev, attacked Lvov, the operation the Germans had been expecting before Operation Bagration. It was the first stage of a charge which would take Konev's armies right through to the Vistula, where just over 2 weeks after crossing the start line, they seized the Sandomierz bridgehead on the western bank less than 200 kilometers south of Warsaw. Meanwhile, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front charged westwards towards the Vistula north and south of Warsaw. As the 65th Army stormed onto Polish territory, Soviet troops had mixed, if not deeply confused, feelings about the local population. This must have been especially true of those who knew how the Soviet Union had behaved towards Poland in 1939, stabbing it in the back as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Poles were their traditional enemy. They were largely anti-communist and reactionary in Soviet eyes, yet they were ferociously anti-German and had resisted bravely. Now they suffered looting and rape at the hands of their supposed liberators. Grossman, no doubt conscious of the Poles' reputation for anti-Semitism, may have felt ambivalent himself as he scribbled a note to prompt him later. About Poles, belief in God, platoons of believers, platoons of non-believers, Catholic priests, hierarchy. He wrote an article celebrating the liberation of Poland. Grossman had no idea of how appallingly the people of eastern Poland had been treated after the Red Army invasion of 1939, when the country was divided up between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Many of the poorer peasants looked forward to the land reform promised by the Polish communist puppet government set up in Lublin. The more educated, however, had good cause to fear that the Stalinists would again continue their policy of eradicating all those who might attempt to challenge communist hegemony. From deciduous forests, from marshes overgrown with bright and thick grass, thousands of Polish peasants are drifting, by foot and in carts, along the deep sandy surfaces of country roads. They are carrying back to their villages the belongings that they hid from the Germans. They are driving cows, calves and horses, these crowds of peasants in felt hats and jackets, walking barefoot, these peasant women in headkerchiefs and aprons, loaded with winter clothes, pillows, blankets, mirrors, home-woven carpets, walking towards our front tank, infantry and cavalry units, are, in fact, expressing inexhaustibly the friendship and trust Polish people have for the Red Army. This countermarch of the Polish peasants driving livestock from the forests and carrying their belongings back to their houses among the thunder of Soviet artillery expresses the Polish peasants' understanding of the moral and political honor of our troops. I asked whether people had looked forward to the Red Army's arrival. Several people said the words which I had heard before. We waited for it like for God. There's only one kind of complaint and lament that I didn't hear in Poland, only one kind of tears that I didn't see, those of Jews. There are no Jews in Poland. They have all been suffocated, killed, from elders to newly born babies. Their dead bodies have been burned in furnaces. And in Lublin, the Polish city with the biggest Jewish population, where more than 40,000 Jews had been living before the war, I haven't seen a single child, a single woman, a single old man who could speak the language that my grandparents spoke. Yet, as Grossman would soon find out for himself when he continued to investigate the operation of the Holocaust in Central Europe, the Poles, despite their anti-communism, were quite unlike the Ukrainians. Very few had collaborated with the Nazis. Yet, as Grossman would soon find out for himself when he continued to investigate the operation of the Holocaust in Central Europe, the Poles, despite their anti-communism, were quite unlike the Ukrainians. Very few had collaborated with the Nazis. The camp was divided into rectangles. Barracks were built in absolutely straight lines. Birch trees were planted along the sand-covered paths. Asters and dahlias grew in the fertilized soil. Concrete pools were made for the waterfowl. There were pools for washing with comfortable steps, outbuildings for the German personnel, a model bakery, a barber's shop, garage, petrol station, warehouses. The camp of Ober-Maidanek and dozens of other labour camps where the Gestapo had planned a long and serious operation were organised according to the same formula, with little gardens, drinking fountains and concrete roads. Camp No. 1 existed from the spring of 1941 until 23 July 1944. Surviving prisoners were annihilated when they could already hear an indistinct faraway rumble from Soviet artillery. In the early morning on the 23rd July, guards and SS soldiers drank some schnapps for courage and began the liquidation of the camp. By the evening, all prisoners at the camp were killed and buried. A carpenter from Warsaw, Max Levitt, survived. He was wounded and lay under the corpses of his comrades until it was dark, and then he crawled into the forest. He told us how, when he was already lying in the trench, he heard the team of 30 boys from the camp sing the song "My Motherland is Vast" just before the execution. He heard how one of the boys shouted, "Stalin will avenge us!" He heard how the leader of the boys, the camp favourite red-haired Lieb, who fell down into the trench after the salvo, lifted himself a little and asked, "Papa guard, you've missed. Please, could you do it once again? One more time." Now we know the whole story about German Ordnung at this labour camp. We know about the work at the sand quarry, about those who did not fulfil the norm and were thrown into the pit from the cliff. We know about the food ration, 170 grams of bread and half a litre of slops, which they called soup. We know about death from starvation, about the swollen people who were taken outside the barbed wire on wheelbarrows and shot. We know about incredible orgies of the Germans, about how they raped girls and shot their forced lovers immediately afterwards, how a drunken German cut off a woman's breast with a knife, how they threw people down from a top-floor window 6 meters from the ground, how a drunken company would take 10 to 15 prisoners from the barracks during the night and practice different methods of killing without haste, shooting the doomed men in the heart, back of the head, eye, mouth, temple. We know about the chief of the camp, the Dutch-German Zan Eilen, a murderer, lover of good horses, a fast rider and lecher. We know about Stumpfer, who was seized by fits of involuntary laughter every time he killed one of the prisoners, or when an execution was carried out in his presence. He had the nickname Laughing Death. We know about the one-eyed German from Odessa, Swiderski, whose nickname was Master Hammer. He was considered the unsurpassed specialist in cold death, and it was he who had killed, in the course of several minutes, 15 children aged from 8 to 13 who had been declared unfit for work. We know about the thin SS man Prey, who looked like a gypsy, whose nickname was Old Man. He was gloomy and reticent. He worked off his boredom by sitting by the camp's rubbish pit and waiting for prisoners who came secretly to eat potato peelings. He made them open their mouths and shot into their open mouths. We know the name of professional murderers Schwartz and Ledecker. It was they who amused themselves by shooting at prisoners walking back from work at dusk. They killed 20, 30 or 40 people every day. All these people had nothing human in them. Their distorted brains, hearts and souls, words and deeds, their habits were like a frightening caricature barely reminiscent of the features, thoughts, feelings, habits and deeds of normal Germans. The order in the camp, and the documentation of murders and love of monstrous jokes that somehow reminded one of those of drunken German soldiers, and the singing in chorus of sentimental songs among the puddles of blood, and the speeches with which they constantly addressed the doomed men, and their preaching and religious sayings printed neatly on special pieces of paper. All these were the monstrous dragons and reptiles that developed from the embryo of traditional German chauvinism, arrogance, egoism, self-assurance, pedantic care for one's own little nest and the iron cold. Indifference to the destiny of all that is living on the earth, from the ferocious belief that German music, poetry, language, lawns, toilets, sky, buildings are the greatest in the universe. But those living in Camp No. 1 knew well that there was something 100 times more terrible than their camp. In May 1942, Germans began to construct another camp, an executioner's block. The construction proceeded rapidly. More than 1,000 workers were involved. According to Himmler's plan, the building of this camp had to be kept top secret, and not a single soul should be given a chance to leave it alive. Guards opened fire without warning if someone passed the camp by accident a kilometre away. The victims who were brought in trains on a special railway line did not know what their fate would be until the last moment. Even guards who accompanied the trains were forbidden to enter the area within the second fence of the camp. When the carriages were fully unloaded, the commandantur of the camp would telephone for a new train, and the empty train would go further along the railway to the quarry where the carriages were loaded with sand for the return journey. The advantage of Treblinka's location became clear. Trains full of victims came from all directions, from the west, east, north and south. The trains had come over a period of 13 months. There were 60 carriages in each train, and there was a number written on each carriage, 150, 180 or 200. This was the number of people in the carriage. People working on the railroad and peasants kept a secret count of these trains. Peasants from the village of Wulka, the closest one to the camp, said to me that there were days when 6 trains passed on the Sedlets line alone, and there was almost not a single day when at least one train did not pass. And the Sedlets line was only one of those which supplied Treblinka. The camp itself, with its perimeter, warehouses for the executed people's belongings, the platform and other auxiliary premises, covers a very small area, just 80 meters by 600, and if one would have the slightest doubt about the fate of the millions of people who had been brought here, one could have reflected that if these people had not been killed by Germans straight upon arrival, then where would they have lived? These people could have been an entire population of a small country or a small European capital city. The area of the camp is so small that if the people who were brought here would have continued to live even a few days after their arrival, there would not be enough room behind the barbed wire for the tide of people flowing in from all over Europe, from Poland and Belarusia. For 13 months, 396 days, the trains left loaded with sand or empty. Not a single man from all those who reached Camp Number 2 ever returned. Cain. Where are they? Those whom you brought here. The summer of 1942, the period of the fascists' great military successes, was declared a good time to carry out the second part of the scheme of physical annihilation. In July, the first trains started coming to Treblinka from Warsaw and Częstochowa. People were told that they were being taken to the Ukraine to work in agriculture. They were allowed to take 20 kilograms of luggage and food. In many cases, Germans had forced their victims to buy railway tickets to the station of Ober-Maidan, which was the cover name the German authorities had given to Treblinka. The point of giving Treblinka this name was that rumours about the terrible place had soon started to circulate all over Poland, and the SS men stopped using the word Treblinka when putting people on trains. However, the way people were treated on the trains left no doubt about the future fate of the passengers. At least 150, but usually 180 to 200 people were forced into a single freight car. During the journey, which lasted sometimes 2 or 3 days, prisoners were given no water. People were suffering so much from thirst that they drank their own urine. Guards charged 100 zloty for a mouthful of water and usually just took the money, giving people no water in return. The people were squashed against one another and sometimes had to stand up all the way. A number of old people with heart problems would usually die before the end of the journey, particularly during the hot days of summer. As the doors were kept shut all the time until the end of the journey, the corpses would begin to decay, poisoning the air in the wagon. If one of the passengers lit a match during the night, guards would start shooting at the side of the freight car. Trains from other European countries arrived at Treblinka in a very different manner. The people in them had never heard of Treblinka and believed until the last minute that they were going there to work. These trains from European countries arrived with no guards and with the usual staff. There were sleeping cars and restaurant cars in them. Passengers had big trunks and suitcases, as well as substantial supplies of food. The passengers' children ran out at the stations they passed and asked whether it was still a long way to Ober-Maidan. It is hard to tell whether it is less terrible to go towards one's own death in the state of terrible suffering, knowing that one was getting closer and closer to one's death, or to be absolutely unaware. Glance from a window of a comfortable passenger car right at the moment when people from the station at Treblinka are telephoning the camp to pass on details about the train which has just arrived and the number of people in it. Apparently, in order to achieve the final deception for people arriving from Europe, the railroad dead-end siding was made to look like a passenger station. On the platform at which another 20 carriages would be unloaded stood a station building with a ticket office, baggage room and a restaurant hall. There were arrows everywhere, indicating to Białystok, to Baranovichi, to Wolokowisk, etc. By the time the train arrived, there would be a band playing in the station building and all the musicians were dressed well. A porter in railway uniform took tickets from the passengers and let them pass on to the square. 3,000 or 4,000 people loaded with sacks and suitcases would go out into this square supporting the old and sick. Mothers were holding babies in their arms. Older children kept close to their parents, looking inquisitively at the square. There was something sinister and horrible in this square whose earth had been trampled by millions of human feet. The strained eyes of the people were quick to catch alarming little things. There were some objects abandoned on the ground, which had been swept hastily, apparently a few minutes before the party emerged. A bundle of clothes, an open case, a shaving brush, enamel saucepans. How did they get here? And why, right where the platform ends, is there no more railway and only yellow grass growing behind a 3-meter-high wire fence? Where is the railway leading to Bialystok, to Siedlce, Warsaw, Włocławek? And the new guards grin in such a strange way, surveying the men adjusting their ties, neat old ladies, boys wearing navy shirts, thin girls who had managed to keep their clothes tidy throughout this journey, young mothers adjusting lovingly the blankets in which their babies are wrapped, the babies who are wrinkling their faces. What is there behind this huge 6-meter-high wall, which is densely covered with yellowing pine branches and with bedding? These coverlets, too, are alarming. They are all different colours, padded, silk or satin. They are reminiscent of the eiderdowns that they, the newcomers, have brought with them. How did this bedding get here? Who brought it with them? And where are their owners? Why don't they need them any longer? And who are these people with light blue armbands? One remembers all the thoughts that have come into one's head recently, all the fears, all the rumours that were told in a whisper. No, no, this can't be true. And one drives the terrible thoughts away. People have a few moments to dwell on their fears in the square, until all the newcomers are assembled in it. There are always delays. In each transport there are the crippled, the limping, and old and sick people who can hardly move their feet. But finally everyone is in the square. An SS Unteroffizier suggests in a loud and distinct voice that the newcomers leave their luggage in the square and go to the bathhouse, with just their personal documents, valuables, and the smallest possible bags with what they need for washing. Dozens of questions appear immediately in the heads of people standing in the square. Whether they can take fresh underwear with them, whether they can unpack their bundles, whether the luggage of different people piled in the square might get mixed up or lost. But some strange force makes them walk, hastily and silently, asking no questions, not looking back, to the gate in a 6-meter-high wall of wire camouflaged with branches. They pass anti-tank hedgehogs, the fence of barbed wire 3 times the height of a man, a 3-meter-wide anti-tank moat, more wire, this time thin, thrown on the ground in concertina rolls, in which the feet of a runner would get stuck like a fly's legs in a spider web, and another wall of barbed wire, many meters high. And a terrible feeling of doom, of being completely helpless comes over them. It's impossible to run away, or turn back, or fight. The barrels of large-caliber machine guns are looking at them from the low wooden towers. Call for help? But there are SS men and guards all around, with submachine guns, hand grenades and pistols. They are the power. In their hands are tanks and aircraft, lands, cities, the sky, railways, the law, newspapers, radio. The whole world is silent, suppressed, enslaved by a brown gang of bandits which has seized power. London is silent, and New York too, and only somewhere on a bank of the Volga, many thousands of kilometers away, the Soviet artillery is roaring. Meanwhile, in the square in front of the railway station, a group of workers with sky-blue armbands is silently and efficiently unpacking the bundles, opening baskets and suitcases, unfastening the straps on the bags. The belongings of the newcomers are being sorted out and evaluated. They throw on the ground someone's carefully arranged sewing kits, balls of threads, children's underwear, undershirts, sheets, jumpers, little knives, shaving sets, bundles of letters, photographs, thimbles, bottles of perfume, mirrors, caps, valenki made from quilts for the cold weather, women's shoes, stockings, lace, pyjamas, packs of transport. Butter, coffee, jars with cocoa, prayer shawls, candle holders, books, rusks, violins, children's blocks. One needs skill to be able to sort out all these thousands of objects within minutes and appraise them. Some are selected to be sent to Germany. Others, the second-rate, the old and the repaired, have to be burned. A worker who'd make a mistake, like putting an old cardboard suitcase into a heap of leather ones selected to be sent to Germany, or throwing a pair of stockings from Paris with a factory label on them into a heap of old mended socks, would get into serious trouble. A worker could make only one mistake. 40 SS men and 60 Wachmänner were working on this was how they referred to the first stage which I have just described. Receiving a train, unloading people at the railway station and getting them into the square and watching the workers who sorted and evaluated the luggage. While doing this job, the workers often secretly shoveled into their mouths pieces of bread, sugar and sweets which they found in the bags with food. This was not allowed. It was, however, permitted to wash hands and faces with eau de cologne and perfumes after they'd finished their work, as water was in scarce supply, and only Germans and guards could use it to wash. And while the people who were still alive were preparing for the bathhouse, their luggage would have already been sorted, valuable things taken to the warehouse, and heaps of letters, photographs of newborn babies, brothers, fiancés, yellowed wedding announcements, all these thousands of precious objects, infinitely important for their owners, but only rubbish for the owners of Treblinka, were piled in heaps and carried to huge holes, where already lay hundreds of thousands of such letters, postcards, visiting cards, photographs, pieces of paper with children's scribbles on them. The square was swept hastily and was ready to receive a new delivery of people sentenced to death. But things did not always go as well as I have just described. Rebellions sometimes broke out in cases when people knew about their destination. A local peasant, Skozaminski, twice saw how people broke out of trains, knocked down the guards and rushed towards the forest. They were all killed to the last man. In one of these cases, the men were carrying 4 children, aged from 4 to 6. The children, too, were killed. A peasant woman, Maria Kobus, told about similar cases. Once she saw how 60 people who had reached the forest were killed. But the new batch of prisoners have already reached the second square, inside the camp's fences. There is a huge barrack in this square and another 3 on the right. 2 of them are warehouses for clothes, the third one for shoes. Further on, in the western part of the camp, there are barracks for SS men, for guards, warehouses for food and a farmyard. Cars and an armed vehicle are standing in the yard. It all looks like an ordinary camp, just like camp number 1. In the southeast corner of the farmyard, there's a space fenced off with tree branches, with a booth at its front, on which is written Sanatorium. Here, all frail and very sick people are separated from the crowd. A doctor in a white apron with a Red Cross bandage on his left sleeve comes out to meet them. I will tell you below in more detail about what happened at the sanatorium. There, Germans used their Walther automatic pistols to spare old people from the burden of all possible diseases. The key to the second phase of handling the newcomers was the suppression of their will by constantly giving them short and rapid orders. These commands were given in that tone of voice, of which the German army is so proud, the tone which proved that Germans belonged to the race of lords. The R, at the same time guttural and hard, sounded like a whip. Achtung! Carried over the crowd. In the leaden silence, the Scharführer's voice pronounced the words, which he had learned by heart, repeating them several times a day for several months. Men stay here. Women and children undress in the barracks on the left. This was when the terrible scenes usually started, according to witnesses. That great maternal, marital, filial love told people that they were seeing each other for the last time. Handshakes, kisses, blessings, tears, brief words uttered by husky voices. People put into them all their love, all the pain, all the tenderness, all the despair. The SS psychiatrists of death knew that they had to cut these feelings off immediately, extinguish them. The psychiatrists of death knew the simple laws that prove true at all slaughterhouses of the world. This moment of separating daughters and fathers, mothers and sons, grandchildren and their grandmothers, husbands and wives was one of the most crucial. And again, Achtung, Achtung resounds above the crowd. This is just the right moment to confuse people's minds once more, to sprinkle them with hope, telling them the regulations of death that pass for those of life. The same voice trumpets word after word. Women and children must take their shoes off when entering the barracks. Stockings must be put into shoes. Children's stockings into their sandals, boots and shoes. Be tidy. And immediately the next order. Going to the bathhouse, you must have your documents, money, a towel and soap, I repeat. Inside the women's barracks was a hairdresser's. Naked women's hair was cut with clippers. Wigs were removed from the heads of old women. A terrible psychological phenomenon. According to the hairdressers, for the women, this death haircut was the most convincing proof of being taken to the banya. Girls felt their hair with their hands and sometimes asked, "Could you cut it again here? It is not even." Women usually relaxed after their hair was cut, and almost all emerged from the barracks with a piece of soap and a folded towel. Some young women cried, mourning their beautiful long plaits. What were the haircuts for? In order to deceive them? No, Germany needed this hair. The hair was a raw material. I've asked many people, what did Germans do with these heaps of hair cut from the heads of the living dead? All the witnesses told me that the huge heaps of black, blonde hair, curls and plaits were disinfected, pressed into sacks and sent to Germany. All the witnesses confirmed that the hair was sent in the sacks to Germany. How was it used? No one could answer this question. Only Kohn stated in his written evidence that the hair was used by the Navy for stuffing mattresses or making hawsers for submarines. I think that this answer requires additional clarification. Men undressed in the yard. Usually, Germans selected 150 to 300 strong men from the first lot to arrive in the morning. They were used to bury corpses and were generally killed on the second day. Men had to undress very quickly and tidily, leaving their shoes and socks in order, folding their underwear, jackets and trousers. Clothes and shoes were sorted by the second team of workers, who wore red armbands that distinguished them from those working on the transport. Clothing and shoes considered suitable for dispatch to Germany were immediately taken to the warehouse. All metal and fabric labels had to be removed from them carefully. The remaining things were burned or buried in the ground. The feeling of anxiety grew every minute. There was a strange, disquieting smell, which was at times overpowered by the smell of chlorine. Huge quantities of importunate flies seemed strange, too. Where were they all coming from? Here, among pines and the trampled earth. People were breathing noisily, afraid, shuddering, peering at every insignificant little object that they thought could explain, help understand, lift slightly the curtain of secret about the fate that lay ahead for them. And why are gigantic excavators rattling so loudly there, further to the south? A new procedure would then begin. Naked people were led to the cash office and asked to submit their documents and valuables. And once again, a frightening, hypnotizing voice would shout, "Achtung! Achtung! Concealing valuables was punishable by death. Achtung! Achtung!" A Scharführer was sitting in a little booth knocked up from timber. SS men and Wachmänner were standing next to him. By the booth stood wooden boxes into which the valuables had to be thrown. A box for banknotes, a box for coins, a box for watches, rings, earrings and brooches for bracelets. And documents, which no one on earth any longer needed, were thrown on the ground. These were the documents of naked people who would be lying in the earth an hour later. But gold and valuables were subject to a careful sorting. Dozens of jewelers determined the pureness of metal, value of jewels, water of the diamonds. And an amazing thing was that the swine utilized everything, even paper and fabric. Anything which could be useful to anyone was important and useful to these swine. Only the most precious thing in the world, a human life, was trampled by their boots. Here, at the cash office, came the turning point. The tormenting of people with lies ended, the torture of not knowing, a fever that threw them within minutes from hope to despair, from visions of life to visions of death. And when the time came for the last stage of robbing the living dead, the Germans changed their style of treating their victims abruptly. They tore rings off their victims' fingers, tore earrings out of their earlobes. At this stage, the conveyor executioner's block required a new principle for functioning efficiently. This is why the word Achtung was replaced by another one, flapping, hissing, Schneller, 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 quick, hurry up, run into the non-existence. We know from the cruel reality of recent years that a naked person immediately loses the strength to resist, to struggle against his fate. When stripped, a person immediately loses the strength of the instinct to live, and one accepts one's destiny like a fate. A person who used to have an intransigent thirst for life becomes passive and indifferent. But to reassure themselves, the SS men applied additionally at this final stage of the conveyor execution work the method of monstrous stupefaction, of sending people into the state of complete psychological, spiritual shock. How did they do that? By applying a senseless, illogical cruelty, suddenly, sharply. Naked people who had lost everything, but still were 1,000 times more human than the beasts in German uniform, were still breathing, watching, thinking. Their hearts were still beating. The guards knocked pieces of soap and towels out of their hands and lined them up in rows, 5 people in each. Hände hoch! Marsch! Schneller! 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 They stepped into a straight alley with flowers and fir trees planted along it. It was 120 meters long and 2 meters wide and led to the place of execution. There was wire on both sides of this alley, and guards in black uniforms and SS men in grey ones were standing there shoulder to shoulder. The road was sprinkled with white sand, and those who were walking in front with their hands up could see the fresh prints of bare feet in this loose sand. Small women's feet, very small children's ones, those left by old people's feet. These ephemeral footprints in the sand were all that was left of thousands of people who had walked here recently, just like the 4,000 that were walking now, like the other thousands who would walk here 2 hours later, who were now waiting for their turn at the railway branch in the forest. People who'd left their footprints had walked here just like those who walked here yesterday, and 10 days ago, and 100 days ago, like they would walk tomorrow, and 50 days later, like people did throughout the 13 hellish months of Treblinka's existence. The Germans called this alley the Road of No Return. A little man who was making faces all the time and whose family name was Sukumil shouted with grimaces, in a deliberately broken German, "Children, children, schneller, schneller, the water's getting cold in the bathhouse, schneller, Kinder, schneller." And he exploded with laughter, squatted, danced. People, their hands still raised, walked in silence between the 2 lines of guards, under the blows of sticks, sub-machine gun butts, rubber truncheons. Children had to run to keep up with the adults. Speaking about this last sorrowful passage, all witnesses mentioned the atrocities of one human-like creature, an SS man called Zepf. He specialized in killing children. This beast, who possessed a massive physical strength, would suddenly seize a child out of the crowd and either hit the child's head against the ground, waving the child like a cudgel, or tear the child in 2 halves. Zepf's work was important. It added to the psychological shock of the doomed people and showed how the illogical cruelty was able to crush people's will and consciousness. He was a useful screw in the great machine of the fascist state. And we should all be terrified, but not by the nature that gives birth to such degenerates. There are lots of monstrosities in the organic world. Cyclops, creatures with 2 heads, as well as the corresponding terrible spiritual monstrosities and perversities. It is another thing that is terrible. These creatures that had to be isolated and studied like psychiatric phenomena were living in a certain country as active and useful citizens. The journey from the cash office to the place of execution took 60 to 70 seconds. People, urged on by the blows and deafened by the shouts, "Schneller! Schneller!" reached the third square and stopped for a moment, startled. In front of them was a beautiful stone building decorated with wood, looking like an ancient temple. 5 wide stone steps led to the low but very wide, massive, beautiful, ornate door. There were flowers growing by the entrance, and flower pots stood there. But all around there was chaos. One could see piles of freshly dug earth every here. A vast excavator was throwing out tons of sandy yellow soil, grinding its steel jaws, and the dust it raised was hanging between the earth and the sun. The rattling of the machine digging from morning till evening, the enormous trench graves mixed with a mad barking of dozens of Alsatian guard dogs. There were narrow-gauge railway lines on both sides of the death building, along which men in baggy overalls brought dumper trucks. The wide door of the death house opened slowly, and 2 assistants of the chief, whose name was Schmidt, appeared by the entrance. They were sadists and maniacs, one of them tall, about 30 years old, with broad shoulders, a dark-skinned, excited face and black hair, the other one younger, short, with brown hair and waxy yellow cheeks. We know the names and surnames of these traitors to mankind. The tall one was holding a massive, metre-long gas tube in his hand. The other one was armed with a sabre. At this moment, the SS men would unleash the trained dogs, who threw themselves on the crowd and tore the naked bodies with their teeth. SS men were beating people with submachine gun butts, urging on petrified women, and shouting wildly, "Schneller! Schneller!" Schmidt's assistants at the entrance to the building drove people through the open doors into the gas chambers. By this time, one of Treblinka's commandants, Kurt Franz, would appear by the building with his dog, Barry, on a leash. He had specially trained his dog to jump at the doomed people and tear their private parts. Kurt Franz had made a good career at the camp. Having started as a junior SS Unteroffizier, he was promoted to the relatively high rank of Untersturmführer. Stories of the living dead of Treblinka, who had until the last minute kept not just the image of humans, but the human soul as well, shake one to the bottom of one's heart and make it impossible to sleep. The stories of women trying to save their sons and committing magnificent doomed feats, of young mothers who hid their babies in heaps of blankets. I've heard the stories of 10-year-old girls who comforted their sobbing parents with a heavenly wisdom, about a boy who shouted when entering the gas chamber, "Russia will take revenge, Mama, don't cry." I was told about dozens of doomed people who began to struggle. I was told about a young man who stabbed an SS officer with a knife, about a young man who had been brought here from the rebellious Warsaw ghetto. He had miraculously managed to hide a grenade from the Germans and threw it into the crowd of executioners when he was already naked. We were told about the battle between a group of rebels and guards and the SS that lasted all night. Shots and explosions of grenades were resounding until the morning, and when the sun rose, the whole square was covered with the bodies of dead rebels. We were told about the tall girl who snatched a carbine from the hands of a Wachmann on the road of no return and fought back. The tortures and execution she was subjected to were terrible. Her name is unknown, and nobody can pay it the respect it deserves. Inhabitants of the village of Wulka, the one closest to Treblinka, tell that sometimes the screams of women who were being killed were so terrible that the whole village would lose their heads and rush to the forest in order to escape from these shrill screams that carried through tree trunks, the sky, and the earth. Then the screams would suddenly stop, and there was a silence before a new series of screams, as terrible as the ones before, shrill, boring through the bones, through the skulls and the souls of those who heard them. This happened 3 or 4 times every day. I asked one of the captured butchers, Sheesh, about these screams. He explained that women started to scream at the moment when the dogs were unleashed and the whole group of prisoners were urged into the house of death. They could see their death coming, and beside that it was very crowded there. They were beaten terribly, and dogs were tearing their bodies. A sudden silence came when the doors of the gas chambers were closed, and the screams started again when a new batch of prisoners was brought to the building. This happened 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day. This was a special conveyor belt to the executioner's block. It took some time for Treblinka to be developed into the industrial complex which I have described here. It grew gradually, developing new workshops. At first, 3 small gas chambers were built. While their construction was still going on, several trains arrived, and the prisoners they brought had to be killed with cold steel, axes, hammers and bludgeons, as the chambers were not ready yet, and the SS men didn't want to start shooting because the noise would reveal Treblinka's purpose. The first 3 concrete chambers were 5 meters by 5 meters and 190 centimeters high. Each of them had 2 doors, one to let the people in by, and the other one to pull out the corpses. This second door was very wide, about 2.5 meters. These 3 chambers were built side by side on the same foundation. The 3 chambers, however, did not have sufficient capacity to satisfy Berlin. Immediately after they began operating, construction commenced on the building which I described above. Treblinka's leaders were very satisfied and proud to have outstripped by such a margin all of the Gestapo's death factory capacity. 700 prisoners worked for 5 weeks to build the new death factory. When the construction was in full swing, an expert arrived from Berlin with his crew to install the chambers. The 10 new chambers were located symmetrically on both sides of a broad concrete corridor. Each of them had 2 doors. The doors for corpses opened onto special platforms which were constructed on both sides of the building. Lines of narrow-gauge railway led to the platforms. The corpses were heaped onto the platforms and immediately loaded onto railway cars and taken to the huge moat graves, which colossal excavators were digging day and night. The floor in the chambers sloped from the corridor down towards the platforms. This made the work of unloading the chambers considerably quicker. Corpses were unloaded from the old chambers in a primitive fashion, carried on stretchers or hauled by straps. The new chambers were each 7 meters by 8 meters. The total floor area of the new chambers was now 460 square meters, and the total area of all gas chambers in Treblinka reached 635 square meters. At this stage, Grossman worked through his calculations on the number of people killed in each batch and extrapolated his figures to estimate that 3 million had been killed in 10 months. Will we be able to find in ourselves enough courage to reflect on what our people were feeling, what they were going through during their last moments in those chambers? We know that they were silent. In the terribly crowded state, which was bone-crushing, their chests were unable to breathe. They were standing squashed against one another with the last sticky death sweat pouring down. They were standing there as one body. What pictures flashed in the glazed, dying eyes? Those of childhood, of the happy, peaceful days, or those of the last harsh journey? The grinning face of the SS soldier in the first square in front of the railway station? So this is why he was laughing. The consciousness is waning. The minute of the terrible last suffering has come. No, it is impossible to imagine. The dead bodies were standing, gradually cooling down. Witnesses said that children were able to breathe for a longer time than the grown-ups. Schmidt's assistants looked into the peepholes 20 to 25 minutes later. The time came to open the door of chambers leading to the platforms. Prisoners in overalls would start the unloading. As the floor sloped towards the platforms, the bodies fell out by themselves. People who were unloading the chambers told me that the faces of dead people were very yellow, and a little blood ran from the noses and mouths of about 70% of them. Physiologists can explain this. The corpses were examined by SS men. If someone was discovered to be still alive, was moaning or moved, this person was shot with a pistol. Then the crews armed with dentists' tongs would set to work wrenching platinum and gold teeth out of dead people's mouths. The teeth were then sorted according to their value, packed into boxes, and sent to Germany. The excavators roared day and night, digging moats hundreds of meters long. These vast trenches were left unfilled, standing open, waiting. And when the whistle blew again, another transport would slowly roll up to the fake railway station, Ober-Maidan. The workers unloading the chambers already knew what was coming. More trains, more bodies, more moats. But what they didn't know was that something was about to change. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe.